I recreated SAVANNAHXYZ in my own style using Blender, and now I'm going to show you how I did it. Now, you might already know Savannah as a singer, dancer, actor, producer, mother or pirate. But if somehow you've yet to come across her work, just follow the link below to her channel, especially if you're a 3D artist, because her content is gold and I am a little bit obsessed. She never fails to make me smile, and I hope that this effort might return the favour. But do that later, don't be falling down the rabbit hole yet before you watch this video, because that's just going to mess up the algorithm and the metrics or anything. So watch this and then go over there. Now before we start, I do have a course on how to sculpt a stylised head in Blender. In this course I take you nice and slowly through the entire process, and rather than try and teach you how to sculpt a head all in one go, we break the process down into much more manageable steps. You'll also be guided through retopology, UV layout, texturing and more. It has over 1500 students, it's rated 5 stars, and I regularly get messages telling me how the structure of the courses really helped the process click for them. So if this sounds interesting to you, make sure you follow the link to the course in the description below, and the first 20 people to use it will get the course at 30% off. But in the meantime, let's sculpt the wonderful Savannah. First we'll create a head in its most simplified form, which is basically an egg with a wedge attached. With the cube selected, press Ctrl 2 to add a subdivision modifier and apply it. Make sure symmetry is turned on and use the grab brush to gently push the shape around until it starts to resemble our target shape. It's quite handy to use the grid in Blender to help with proportions. And just like that, we've got our first shape down. And if you're following along with my course, you can also check your progress against a 3D reference to see if it matches. Our next task is to add basic shapes for the neck, torso and ears. Starting with the neck, add a cylinder and use hotkey S to adjust the scale. The neck should travel at a slight angle, so use the hotkey R to rotate it slightly. Then in edit mode, use Ctrl R to add a few edge loops and then scale them to create a taper towards the centre of the neck. Add a cube for the torso and press Ctrl 3 to smooth it out with a subdivision surface modifier. Now scale it on the Z axis and move it into position. Now like the neck, we want the torso to be slightly angled, only this time in the opposite direction to the neck. Then using the grab brush, create this V shape from a front view. For the ears, we want to add a plane and rotate it 90 degrees on X. Then use the hotkey Ctrl 1 to add a subdivision modifier and then apply it. I'll drag it off to the side, and then in edit mode I'll move the vertices around to start creating our basic ear shape. Then I'll press the hotkeys I to inset the faces, numpad 7 to jump to a top view, A to select all, and then E to extrude to give our ear some thickness to it. After positioning the ear behind the jaw, we can then extrude the back of the ear where it connects to the head. We can also add another subdivision modifier and tweak the shape using our grab brush. Again, if you have the course, you can check that you're on the right track using the 3D references, and that's our second checkpoint reached. So what you can do now is, in the outliner, group these shapes into a collection and duplicate them so that you can always get back to this point if you ever get lost moving forwards. So for part 3, rather than add any new shapes, we're just going to modify those that are in our scene already, starting with the head. Using the draw sharp brush, mark the chin out like so. Now mark out where the front of the face meets the side and where the cheekbone will go like this. The point of this is to establish where our main plane changes will be. I do smooth these marks away a little bit, but they are still there. But it might help you to keep these plane changes a bit more obvious for the time being. Onto the ears, using the mask brush, mark the area on the ear that we want to be pushed in, and then use Ctrl I to invert the mask. Then we can use draw sharp to shape our inner ear. Feel free to play around with the shape. It's much easier to experiment during these early stages than it is after we've started to add details. Now the next step is to carve out some space for our facial features. These mainly sit between the brow, which I've just marked out with draw sharp, the top of the chin and the sides of the face. You can use clay build-up, holding Ctrl to invert the action to start carving away, leaving space for the nose. Now this part can be a little bit tricky and probably where most of my students struggle the most. The key is to take your time. Don't rush towards the target shape, just creep up to it very slowly, like I am here. always be looking around the model to check that it's working from all angles. Now, it might seem counterintuitive, but I tend to find that the slower I move here, the faster I get the job done, because when I move slower, I tend to be more accurate. Furthermore, you want to make sure that these shapes are accurate anyway, because they're going to serve as the foundation to the rest of the head later on. After working the mesh for a few minutes, we end up with a clean shape like this and can move our attention back to the torso. For the lower torso, simply duplicate the upper torso and rotate. This naturally gives us an hourglass shape from the front view, but the side view will need attention. Now again, we want to see a tilt, and again it's going to move counter to the portion above it. Now merge the two pieces together and smooth out the transition. Using the line project brush, slice the areas on the torso where it meets the arms and legs. Now use draw sharp to mark out some bony landmarks, such as the clavicle, rib cage, spine, scapula, and pelvis. You might also want to indicate the stomach at this point. And also feel free to check the proportions of your character by duplicating the head. At the time, I wanted my character to be about 6 heads tall, so 3 heads for the upper half is spot on. Moving on to the legs, I scale the cube on the Z-axis and add a subdiv modifier to smooth it. This can represent our upper leg, and we can duplicate this to create the lower legs. Now using the grab brush, we can start pushing the shapes around to better resemble simplified legs. Try and keep an eye on the widest areas of the shapes and how they taper downwards. And notice again how the shapes don't travel down in a straight line, particularly from a front view. Moving on to the shoulder, again add a cube and apply a subdivision modifier at level 1. Now using the grab brush, we can now tweak the vertices to look more like a simplified shoulder. I'm going to use Ctrl R to add some edge loops here so that it retains its shape better when we add another subdiv modifier. And then we want to add a mirror modifier for the other side. For the knee, again, it's just another cube with a subdivision modifier. I'm going to scale it slightly on the Z axis and rotate it on X. For the upper arm, we add yet another cube and then scale it on the Z axis. But before you add a subdiv modifier, cut in some edge loops like I have here so we get more of a cylindrical shape. We could have just added a cylinder from the start, but the topology is a little bit nicer to work with this way. Again, we want to duplicate this shape for our lower arm. As with everything else, finding the shape of the arms can be quite tricky, but just take your time. And as I said with the legs, try to see where the widest points are and how they create a taper. Also notice how I'm keeping the wrist quite a blocky shape compared to the more rounded shape where it meets the upper arm. The elbows are created much in the same way as the knees by adding a cube, scaling it slightly on the Z axis, and then moving it into position. The boobs are created by adding a subdivided cube, moving it into position, rotating it outwards slightly, and then pulling the top into a sort of teardrop shape towards the centre of the chest. If you've studied anatomy a bit, you might want to modify the shape at this point to incorporate the chest muscles underneath too. Notice that we also start to form an armpit as well when we do this. For the hands, I'm going to level with you. I took a bit of a shortcut and added some pre-made hands for this project to save some time. Now I would only recommend doing this if you know that you're capable of creating hands from scratch yourself, because otherwise you're going to be leaving gaps in your knowledge. And I realised that doing this doesn't necessarily make for the best tutorial type video, but I didn't realise that I'd be going into this much depth when I was recording it, otherwise I'd have made them from scratch, so we'll park that for a future video. I did, however, start the feet from scratch, which, as ever, is a subdivided cube, which we can scale and position, and then just push into shape using the grab brush. Now, like the hands, this is quite a complicated shape, so take your time here and find some good reference. Now, since I know the character will be wearing shoes, I do skip modelling the toes to save a bit of time, but obviously if your character's barefoot or you just want to practice sculpting toes, then you're going to want to spend a little bit more time here. And now that we have all of our basic shapes in the scene, just spend a bit of time making sure that everything looks correct and the shapes are interacting with each other as you would expect. Once you're happy with it, we can again duplicate the collection in the outliner so that we can always fall back to this point if we ever get lost moving forwards. Next, we're going to focus our attention back to the head, and I know that I want to sculpt some eyelids, but first it would be useful to add some eyeballs to build them around. And for these, I use the Danny Mac Eye Designer, which is an add-on that I created a few years ago for quickly importing stylized eyes. Don't worry if you don't have this though, some good old-fashioned spheres will do. It just means you'll have to spend a bit of extra time texturing them later. Now we can get to work on the eyelids. Using Draw Sharp, hold Ctrl to make some sharp edges. From a front view, you want to be able to see the top plane of the bottom eyelid and the bottom plane of the top eyelid. Now use Draw Sharp again to cut in the upper eyelid crease. And keep in mind that the skin folds in on itself here. To clean the shapes up, I usually use a combination of Draw Sharp for the edges and the scrape brush for the planes. The next thing we want to look at is the nose. Start by marking out the sides of the nostrils using Draw Sharp. Then use it to dig a hole inside the nostrils. And still with Draw Sharp, hold Ctrl and mark the plane change across the front of the nose. Now add some subtle marks to indicate the cartilage. Now I should say that this process does take a bit of practice, so don't worry if you don't get it first time. Just keep trying and I promise it'll start to click. The mouth will again make heavy use of Draw Sharp. First we want to use it to mark out the corners of the mouth, then the centre line of the lips, and then underneath the bottom lip. Then holding Ctrl, mark where the top of the top lip will go. It should feel like it's pulling into the corners of the lips. Then you can fill in the top lip using clear build-up, but make sure that it retains its downward facing plane. And then we want to do the opposite for the bottom lip. Mark the bottom lip with Draw Sharp, and then fill it in with clear build-up, making sure you retain that upward facing plane. Now something to bear in mind about the lips is that the top lip sits on top of the bottom lip. This means that it's easier to get more natural looking lips if the top and bottom lip aren't joined together like they are now. And we'll be able to do that later once we have retopologized the head, but for now we can just use masking to work on each lip individually. We have a few options for creating eyelashes, but I'm just going to model them directly onto the head using Retopology tools. We can then add 3 modifiers: mirror, solidify and subdivision. And we can create the eyebrows in pretty much exactly the same way. We can draw the brows directly onto the head using our Retopology tools, and then add the same 3 modifiers: mirror, solidify and subdivision. To start the hair, you'll see me grabbing a strand from my previous project just because it's a lot quicker to get going. But essentially this is just a path curve with a curved shape set as its bevel object. And all we need to do here is just keep duplicating and positioning each strand while keeping an eye on the front view that we've got over here on the right. And we don't want to spend too much time finessing, because once we start pausing the character, the pose of the hair will change too. Now we can approach the clothing in kind of the same way we did with the eyebrows, by using Retopology tools to model it directly over our mannequin. Doing it this way means that we have good topology right from the get-go, while conforming to the body. And personally, I prefer creating clothing this way over simulation, using something like Marvelous Designer, because it allows for very specific control over the shape. We can then use our sculpting brushes to fix any areas that might be clipping, and then work on creating clean, simple shapes. Now, initially I did create the puffed out arms as seen in the original character, but I did end up changing that, which I'll explain later. Now, to set the colour, I just colour picked from the original design to get, sort of in the ballpark, and then played around with it until it looked about right. And the leggings can be created in the same way as the jumper, using Retopology tools to model them around the underlying mesh. Now in this case I did save a tiny bit of time by not completing them at the waist, because I knew that that area would never be seen. Next we want to work on the trainers, and trainers are a tricky shape to get sometimes, so to save time I pulled some in that I made a while back. But since it's only the shape that I'm after, I remeshed it all and then smoothed over all the details. We're just looking for the general shape of the shoe at this point. We can come back and detail this out a bit later. Next, what I want to do is retopologise the head, and this is something I cover in quite a lot of detail in my course, but I'll mention a couple of pointers here that you might want to be mindful of. Now first off, you might be wondering why I'm retopologising at all if this isn't going to be animated. Well, a benefit of retopology that I don't see many people talking about is how much control it gives you over the mesh, and this is because it gives you subdivision levels to work with. If you want to make big changes to the underlying form, you drop the subdivision levels right down. And if you want to make smaller changes to the finer details, you hop back up to the highest subdivision level. And then some changes are more suitable somewhere in between, so having subdivision levels is really handy to have while you're sculpting. Retopology also makes creating UVs a lot easier too, which we're going to need shortly. And I know it can be a pain, but once you get the hang of retopology, it really doesn't take that long. So I definitely recommend getting used to it if you can. And now I'm going to stop saying the word retopology. Now, a common mistake I see beginners make with it is going too high resolution too early. Now we've all been there, but what you want to bear in mind is that it's much quicker to add cuts into a well-designed mesh than it is to furiously add geometry until it works. Now the ear can be a bit of a pain to retopologise, but try not to worry too much about getting it perfect. Unless your character has special ears that need animating, you can usually get away with less than perfect topology and no one will even notice because the ears just don't move. Even though this character won't open her mouth, we are going to add a mouth bag because it will allow us to separate the upper and lower lips and work on them independently much easier. And we can do this by first applying the shrink wrap and then extruding the vertices around the lips inside the head. And now that we've got clean topology, it's really easy to create face sets on the upper and lower lips. Now if I press Alt A and select face sets, the brush will automatically mask based on anything that is different to the face set you're working on. Now, as I've mentioned, another benefit of retopologizing the head is creating UVs easier. We do this by jumping into edit mode and marking the edges on our head where we want the seams to be. And then once we've done that, we can then press U, unwrap, to unwrap the mesh. Now when you're painting the head, start by adding a base skin tone all over and then adding red to the cheeks and nose. And if we plug our painting into subsurface colour and then tweak the colours using a curves node, so we want to make it a bit darker and a little bit redder, we can get a decent real-time render of our skin while we're painting, and this feels really nice to work with. And we also want to add a little bit of red to the lips and to the ears. Now that we have our blockout done, it's time to rig the character, which might surprise you because usually we retopologise the whole thing and finish the sculpting before rigging, but in this case, we're taking a slightly different approach by rigging the mannequin. And the reason for doing this is that it actually avoids spending a lot of time on rigging, or more specifically, painting the weights. Because by rigging and posing at this stage, we don't need to be worried about how the mesh deforms, and we can just move elements around however we like and then just clean it up afterwards when we continue sculpting on it later. Now we start off by building a skeleton on one side of our mannequin. If we name our bones using the suffix .l to denote the left side, we can automatically mirror the skeleton over. Since it's just a mannequin we're rigging, we can also just parent each element directly to its respective bone, so there's no need to paint weights. The only exception here is the head, since the neck is connected to it. So for that, I'll rig it with automatic weights, and then quickly adjust the weighting using the weight paint tools. Once that's done, we can move on to posing our character. Now ideally, you'll already know what pose you're going for, but in this situation, I didn't really, so I'm just playing around with a few ideas. Eventually, I decided that I wanted to go with the idea of Savannah holding her hands up as though she's framing a shot, since that's what I know her for, so it made sense to me. And I also know her as being really into Blender, so I tried to incorporate elements from that, such as the default cube, the axis arrows, and Suzanne into the scene. Once we've found a pose we like, it's time to get back to sculpting. In hindsight, I probably could have spent a little bit more time getting the rig a bit nicer to avoid having so much cleanup, because this is a bit of a mess, but I do think I saved time in the long run. And to be fair, I don't actually need to be fixing the anatomy here, since none of this will actually be seen in the final render, but I figured that it'd be good practice for me to try and get this working, so really, I'm just doing this for me. So the way we're approaching it here is to keep the pieces separate for as long as possible, because they're easier to manipulate this way. And then we'll gradually merge it all together and work the transitions between the pieces. From here, it's really about working and reworking what we already have down. Now, I could go into a lot more detail about this, but I am conscious that this video is starting to get super long at this point, so I'll just mention a few notable things that I did before getting to the final result. First off, I made the head a little bit smaller. Now, I do generally like characters that are about 6 heads tall, but I felt like the head just looked a little bit too big in this case. I also tweaked the pose slightly to make it a little more dynamic. And what I mean by that is, remember when we were working on our side view and nothing was actually vertical, it just kind of bounced from side to side? Well, this is something you generally want to get into your poses as well. And while I was streaming, somebody rightfully pointed out that the pose could be a little bit more dynamic. So I did end up just tweaking the pose a little bit too. And I did promise earlier that I would explain why I changed the puffy arms as seen in the original character. Now, the problem I had with these is that when we look at a forearm, we're expecting to see a taper from the elbow to the wrist. And the puffy arms reverse this. It caused a taper towards the elbow from the wrist. And I just couldn't get it to look right on my character. It's like no matter what I did, it just looked off. And so when I tried switching it around so it looked more like what we would expect, you know, a taper towards the wrist, it just looked a lot better. So I just ended up going with a more skin tight sweater in the end. And then after many hours of tweaking, it was finally time to hit the render button. But before we see the final result, don't forget to like the video and subscribe, of course, so you don't miss the next one. We're going to be 3D printing this character, so it's going to be a lot of fun, don't miss it. But until then, this is SAVANNAHXYZ reimagined in my style.